Hi everybody, so today we're going to be talking about the parts of the eye. So let's go ahead and get started. This is just basically going to be the anatomy of the eye. I'm going to talk more about how the eye works in another video. So let's go ahead and get started. And what you're looking at here is the eye. So imagine what this view is that if I were to be looking straight forward and then I turned to the side and we sliced my eye in half and then we took half of the eye off, and what you have left is what we're looking at here. So the eye is basically made up of different layers, and the outermost layer is what we call the fibrous tunic. Is going to be our outermost layer here, okay? And the fibrous tunic is made up of two different parts. The first part is going to be the cornea, and the cornea is the clear part that you see on the eye. It's the part that actually sticks out a little bit. So this is the clear part of the eye. And it has a few different functions, but the main ones that it does is it's going to direct light through the pupil. The pupil is this part right here, and it's just an opening in the iris. Most people don't notice, but your pupil is actually just a hole. The black part that you see is just a hole, right? And it's going to direct light through the pupil and onto the lens. Now what we do is, because it bends the light to come in here, we call that refraction. But for the most part, the cornea is going to direct light to the lens. Okay? So, and the other thing it's going to do is, because it's a covering over the pupil, it's going to keep germs out of the eye. Now, the cornea also doesn't have a very big blood supply, so therefore you can actually transplant corneas from one person to the next pretty easy. The second part of the fibrous tunic is going to be the sclera. And the sclera is the white part of the eye. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the sclera actually contains a lot of little blood vessels. And when those blood vessels become dilated, that's when you get red eyes. The sclera also goes all the way around to the back of the eye. This whole part in here is part of the sclera. So it starts off with the white of the eye, and then it goes all the way around. And the reason it goes all the way around is because that's where your eye muscles, the muscles that move your eye, attach to. So it has muscles attached to it. Okay? So that's it for the fibrous tunic, okay? So we're going to direct light to the lens here so it can be directed back into here. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The second part, the second tunic, is going to be called the vascular tunic. And the vascular tunic is going to be made up of three layers also. The first layer is going to be called the iris. So I should say the first part, not the first layer. That's the iris. The iris is the colored part of your eye. Okay. The other thing is that the iris is going to control how much light comes into the eye. So it controls the amount of light coming into the eye. So if you've ever seen, the more light there is, usually the smaller your pupils get. So we're going to look at this real quick, because the iris is going to contain two muscles, and those two muscles are going to be the dilator pupillae and the sphincter pupillae. So if we look right here, this black part is going to be the pupil. That's the hole in the eye, right? That's where light's going to go into. The cornea is going to direct light. And by the way, to give you an idea, now you're just looking at the eye straight this way. So this is going to be the pupil. Now, if you notice around the pupil, I have a circular muscle, which we call a sphincter, right? And that's going around the pupil. So this is going to be my sphincter pupillae. Okay, that's the sphincter pupillae. And what this is going to do, and again, it's the round part there, when there's a lot of light, we want to close down the pupil. We want to make it smaller. So as you can see by these arrows, what this is going to do is this is going to twist and turn, and it's going to make my pupil smaller, right? If you've ever seen a camera, if you recall at one time on cameras, what would happen is we would have people, if you took a picture at night, what would happen is the people, you could see the red in the back of their eyes, which is basically the blood vessels in the back of their eyes, right? So what they do now on cameras is they have it flash several times before it takes the actual picture. And the reason for that is because it activates the sphincter pupillae, and it causes the pupil to become smaller. So now you don't get those red eyes. Now let's say that it becomes dark, right? Let's say it becomes dark. And what's going to happen now is you have something called the dilator pupillae, right? This is going to do the opposite. When it becomes dark, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we get more light into the eye. Let me write this somewhere where I don't have a glare. So this is going to be my dilator pupillae, right? And what these do now is when it's dark, we want that pupil to become bigger, right? So we want this to become bigger. So these muscles now are going to pull this way. And as they pull out this way, the pupil becomes bigger. And as the pupil becomes bigger, we allow more light to go into the eye. So those are the two muscles that are going to make up the iris, right? I have my sphincter pupillae and I have my dilator pupillae, which are going to control the amount of light that actually gets into the eye. So let's take a look at the next part. And if we look here, we have these here. This brown part here and this brown part here. This is the second part of the vascular tunic, and we're going to call these the ciliary bodies. Okay? So this is my ciliary body here. And this is a ciliary body down in here. Okay? And what these do is, if you notice, they're attached. We have ciliary processes here, and we'll talk more about the ciliary processes in just a minute. But if you notice, we have these black lines here. Those are ligaments. They're called suspensory ligaments. And the suspensory ligaments attach onto the lens. Some books actually call those zonules, but basically those attach onto the lens. Now what's going to happen is if we have something that's close, we want to direct the light onto the retina, which is back in here. We'll be talking about this in just a minute. So what's going to happen is we actually want this thing to become more round. We want the lens to become more round if we're looking at something that's close, right? Light's going to be coming in this way, and we want the lens to be more round so that we can have it focused back on this retina. If this isn't round enough, then the light rays would actually basically cross or connect somewhere behind the retina if they could get back there, which obviously they can't, right? So here's what's going to happen, is when we have something close and we want to make this more round, this muscle, the ciliary body, is going to contain the ciliary muscle, right? And the ciliary muscle is going to contract. When this contracts, this pulls up and inward, right? And then from here, when it contracts, it's going to pull down and inward, right? And then remember, this is a whole circle. So basically everything's kind of pulling forward and inward a little bit. When it does that, it causes these muscles to relax. So this contracts, these ligaments relax. The muscle goes up, the ligaments relax. As the ligaments relax, the lens becomes more round. And that's what's going to happen when we want to see an object that's close. That way, again, we can focus the light back here on the retina, okay? The opposite happens when we're looking at something far. When we're looking at something far away, we want to make this lens thinner. So what actually happens is this relaxes, and as this relaxes, it does the opposite effect. The ciliary muscles go pulled down this way, or they relax, which causes this to come down this way, and that would basically go up. And again, it's round, right? So we're going to be pulling up away from this. So this would be going that way, and that'd be going that way, which would cause these to become tighter, which would cause the lens to become thinner. So if it's something close, this is going to contract and go up and in, right? Or kind of come forward and in, right? Which is going to relax the ligaments, which is going to cause the lens to become more round. If it's something that's far away, these relax. As they relax, they kind of pull away like this. They cause the ligaments to become tighter, which causes the lens to become thinner, okay? So that's basically what the ciliary bodies are gonna do, and the ciliary muscles. Now, the other thing I have on here is on the ciliary processes, I actually have some cells on here. And these cells are going to produce a fluid called aqueous humor. So I'm going to get aqueous humor, which is going to be released by these ciliary processes, right? This is my ciliary process. And I'm going to get aqueous humor. Now the aqueous humor is basically going to come up, it's going to go through the pupil and to the front part of the eye. This back part here, that we see back here, this is known as the posterior chamber. So right in here is my posterior chamber. Okay? This part that you see here is going to be known as my anterior chamber. The posterior chamber and the anterior chamber make up the anterior cavity. So my anterior cavity is made up of the posterior chamber and the anterior chamber. Those make up my anterior cavity. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to get this aqueous humor coming from my posterior chamber. It's going to go through the pupil, and then down in here somewhere, down in here, I am going to have an opening. And it's going to be like a drain. Okay, so my aqueous humor, which has been released by these cells on the ciliary processes, are going to drain into this opening, or we call it the canal. This is known as the canal of Schlemm. So here's what happened. Is let's say we have a problem with this canal of Schlemm, and for some reason it does not drain properly. If it does not drain properly, what's going to happen is I am going to continue to have this aqueous humor be released, and it's going to start to cause more pressure in here. Right? It's going to start to build up. It's going to start to cause more pressure. As it causes more pressure, it's going to put more intraocular pressure in the eye, and then I can end up with a condition called glaucoma. Right? So we want to make sure that this canal of Schlemm is always working properly. If you've ever gone to an optometrist, one of the first things they do is to have you sit down, they blow air into your eyes. This is what they're going to check for, is glaucoma. So there's the canal of Schlemm. So once again, the ciliary processes have cells that release aqueous humor. The aqueous humor is going to build up in the posterior chamber. From the posterior chamber, it's going to go to the anterior chamber, and then it's going to drain in the canal of Schlemm. And the posterior chamber and the anterior chamber make up the anterior cavity. Now, if you notice, the other thing we have here, where you see these white lines, this is called my choroid. So the other part here is going to be my choroid. And the choroid is basically going to have a few different functions. The choroid is basically going to supply blood to the parts of the eye. And the choroid is also going to be responsible for absorbing light as it comes in, because as the light comes in, some of it scatters, and the choroid is going to basically be responsible for that. So in the vascular tunic, as the iris, which is the colored part of the eye, which is going to control how much light comes into the eye, right? And the ciliary bodies, which these are going to control the size of the lens. Or actually, let's say the shape of the lens. Okay, and then the choroid is going to basically supply blood to the eye, and it's also going to be responsible for absorbing light. Okay, so it absorbs the light that scatters. So any light that comes through the lens that is not being directed back onto the retina here is going to be absorbed by the choroid. Okay? So that's the vascular tunic. Let's talk about the back part of the eye right here real quick. And the back part of the eye is going to be called the vitreous, it's going to be called the posterior chamber. So the back of the eye is going to be the posterior chamber. Posterior cavity. It's the posterior cavity. So once again, the posterior chamber and the anterior chamber made up the anterior cavity. The posterior cavity is just this part right in here. The posterior cavity is going to have a gel-like substance that we call vitreous humor. All right, so that's going to be the posterior cavity. It's a gel-like substance. Okay, so now, if we look here at the last part on this, we are going to be talking about something called the neural tunic. The neural tunic is basically this blue part you see right here, and it's going to be made up of two different parts. Okay, so the neural tunic is going to be made up of the pigmented layer Okay, and now the pigmented layer is basically going to have a few different functions. The first thing about the pigmented layer is, like the choroid, it's going to absorb excess light. Okay, so I'm not going to go too much into it here, but what's going to happen as we come back through here and we have the lens, light's basically going to come. My pigmented layer would actually be all the way back in here next to this choroid. And so basically light would come through here, and it's basically, if it passes through the retina and gets to the pigmented layer, it's going to be absorbed, okay? The other thing that the pigmented layer is going to do is it plays a role in maintaining what we call photoreceptors, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but it's going to phagocytize excess or remnants of photoreceptors. Okay, so it helps maintain them. So it does phagocytosis of photoreceptor remnants. Okay, so that's going to be what this does here. Okay, and then the last thing it does is it stores vitamin A. Okay, so now that's the first part. We have the pigmented layer here, right? So the next thing that's going to happen on this is we are going to have our photoreceptors, right? We're going to have photoreceptors. And this is actually the part that's going to help you see, is on the photoreceptors. So you have two types of photoreceptors. You have rods, and the rods help you see at night. Okay? And then you have something called cones, and cones help you see in the light. So I tell people rods help you see at night, cones help you see in the light. And the cones also see color. So they're going to be responsible for seeing color. So that's going to be our cone. So that's going to be the neural tunic. Now here's what's going to happen is light's going to come back from here, okay? And it's going to hit the retina. Well, what happens is these photoreceptors are going to attach to other cells, which I'll go through in another video. And they're going to basically have nerves that come from here that are going to come and make up the optic nerve that you see right here. So this is my optic nerve right here, right? And the optic nerve leaves the back of the eye. Now, where the optic nerve leaves the back of the eye is right where you see these green lines here, and this is called the optic disc. The optic disc is where your blind spot is because you have no photoreceptors. So that's going to be the blind spot. So looking real quick too at the retina here, right? Because this here's my retina. And what's going to happen on the retina is you're going to have an area that we want to focus the light from. So the lens is going to focus the light onto an area here. Okay, and this area is going to be called the macula lutea, or it's more simpler known as the macula. The macula is going to contain both rods and cones. In the center of the macula, though, we're going to have an area, depression, a little depression down in here. I'm going to kind of make it big, but a little depression down in there. And this area is going to be called the fovea centralis. So the fovea centralis is basically in the center of the macula. Now the macula, like I said, has rods and cones. The fovea centralis basically has only cones. And this is where our best vision takes place. So what's going to happen is the lens is going to try to focus the light right onto the fovea centralis. Okay, so some more things real quick is, remember, this blue part is all the retina. Out in this area in here, this is where most of my rods are found, is in those blue areas. Not so much in this area here, because this area here has more cones. Okay, so I have rods out in this area, some in the macula, and none in the fovea centralis. The other thing is you have a lot more rods than cones. You have about 120 million rods. You only have about 6 million cones. Okay, so that's it for the eye. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please hit the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.